Cruel millionaire forces Maid to play piano, but her talent surprises everyone. The antique Steinway grand piano stood majestically in the corner of Emily Barrett's modest living room in Bath, its polished mahogany surface reflecting the warm glow of the morning sun. At 23, Emily's slender fingers danced across the keys with practiced grace, bringing to life a piece she had played countless times before, Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, her grandfather William's favorite composition. The piano was more than just an instrument. It was her most precious possession, a legacy from the man who had shaped her life through music. William Barrett had been a respected musician in his youth, playing in various orchestras across England, before settling down in Bath to teach music. Every morning before dawn, Emily would practice on this very piano, just as she had done since she was 5 years old, under her grandfather's patient guidance. "You're playing it too fast again, love." She could almost hear his gentle correction, a memory that brought both a smile and a hint of tears to her eyes. The instrument had been his parting gift to her 2 years ago, when age had finally caught up with him, leaving behind a void that only music could fill. The morning light streamed through the Victorian windows of their modest terraced house, casting long shadows across the worn carpet. The house itself, located in one of Bath's less fashionable neighborhoods, had seen better days, but it was home. The wallpaper was fading, and the furniture had long since gone out of style, but the piano made everything else fade into insignificance. "Emily, dear, you'll be late for work," her mother's voice called from the kitchen, breaking through the music. Margaret Barrett, a hard-working woman who had raised Emily single-handedly, was already dressed in her nurse's uniform, preparing for another long shift at the Royal United Hospital. Emily glanced at the clock and quickly closed the piano lid. She couldn't afford to be late for her shift at the Royal Crescent Hotel, one of Bath's most prestigious establishments. The job as a waitress wasn't her dream, but it paid the bills and helped support her mother, who had sacrificed so much for her over the years. As she hurried to change into her uniform, Emily caught her reflection in the mirror. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, her green eyes, so like her grandfather's, bright with determination. She straightened her name badge and smoothed down her black skirt, ensuring she met the hotel's exacting standards. "I've left you some breakfast," Margaret called out as Emily rushed down the stairs, "and don't forget your umbrella. The forecast says rain later." Emily grabbed a piece of toast and kissed her mother's cheek. "Thanks, Mum. Will you be home for dinner?" "Double shift today, I'm afraid, but Mrs. Henderson next door said she'd look in on you." Margaret's face showed the worry she always carried about leaving her daughter alone, even though Emily was well into adulthood. "Mum, I'll be fine. I might practice a bit when I get home anyway." Emily adjusted her coat and headed for the door, but not before casting one last glance at the piano. It stood there, silent, but full of promise, like a guardian of dreams yet to be fulfilled. The walk to work took Emily through the heart of Bath, past the Roman baths and the magnificent abbey. The city was already coming to life, tourists gathering despite the early hour, shops beginning to open their doors. Emily loved these morning walks, when the golden stone buildings seemed to glow in the early light, and she could almost imagine herself back in the city's Georgian heyday. At the hotel, Emily's supervisor, Mrs. Phillips, was waiting with her usual stern expression. "Barrett, you're just in time. We have a full house this morning, and Mr. Richardson has specifically requested you for service in the breakfast room." Emily nodded, suppressing a sigh. Mr. Richardson was one of their regular guests, an elderly businessman who had taken a grandfatherly interest in her after discovering her musical background. He often requested her service so he could discuss classical music while she poured his tea. As she began her duties, Emily's mind wandered to the upcoming weekend. The hotel was hosting a charity gala, and she had been assigned to work it. The event would bring together some of Bath's most influential residents, including Jonathan Blackwood, the notorious property developer whose recent projects had caused quite a stir in the historic city. Little did Emily know that this upcoming event would set in motion a chain of events that would transform her life forever. As she served breakfast to the hotel's wealthy guests, she remained unaware that her grandfather's piano carried more than just musical memories. It held secrets that would soon emerge to challenge everything she thought she knew about her family's history. The morning passed in a blur of coffee cups and polite smiles, but through it all, Emily held on to her private dream. Someday, she thought, she would play for more than just herself and her memories. Someday she would make her grandfather proud on a proper stage. Until then, she would continue to practice in the early morning hours, keeping alive the legacy he had left her, one note at a time. The charity gala arrived sooner than Emily expected, but it wasn't taking place at the Royal Crescent Hotel as she had initially thought. Instead, the venue had been changed to Blackwood Manor, the imposing Georgian mansion overlooking Bath from its privileged position on Lansdowne Hill. The last-minute change had thrown the hotel's staff into disarray, as they were now required to provide service at the private residence. Jonathan Blackwood's reputation preceded him. At 45, he had built his fortune transforming historic properties across England into luxury developments, earning both acclaim for his business acumen and criticism for his apparent disregard for preservation. His recent acquisition of several historic buildings in Bath had made him a controversial figure in the city. Emily stood at the entrance of Blackwood Manor, taking in the magnificent building with its perfectly manicured gardens and sweeping driveway. The autumn evening was unusually mild, and the setting sun cast a golden glow over the Bath stone facade. Inside, she could hear the murmur of guests arriving and the clink of champagne glasses. "Barrett, stop dawdling and help with the canapes, Mrs. Phillips commanded, hurrying past with a tray of delicate hors d'oeuvres. Emily quickly made her way to the kitchen, where chaos reigned as the hotel staff attempted to adapt to the unfamiliar setting. The manor's interior was a testament to wealth and sophisticated taste. Crystal chandeliers hung from ornately decorated ceilings, and priceless artworks adorned the walls. In the main reception room, a beautiful grand piano stood on a raised platform, a Bösendorfer that made Emily's heart skip a beat. Her fingers itched to touch those pristine keys, but she pushed the thought aside and focused on her duties. As the evening progressed, Emily moved efficiently through the crowds of Bath's elite, serving drinks and maintaining the professional demeanor expected of hotel staff. She couldn't help but notice the striking resemblance between Jonathan Blackwood and the portraits of a woman she assumed was his mother, which hung in prominent positions throughout the house. "Your service has been impeccable," a cultured voice said behind her. Emily turned to find Jonathan Blackwood himself standing there, his steel-grey eyes appraising her with interest. He was tall and distinguished-looking, with silver threading through his dark hair at the temples. "You're from the Royal Crescent Hotel, aren't you?" "Yes, sir," Emily replied politely. "Emily Barrett, at your service." Something flickered across his face at the mention of her surname, but it disappeared so quickly she thought she must have imagined it. "Barrett," he repeated, as if testing the name. "Tell me, Miss Barrett, do you play?" He gestured toward the piano. Before Emily could respond, one of the guests called out, "Oh, do let's have some music, Jonathan. That beautiful instrument's been silent all evening." Blackwood's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "What do you say, Miss Barrett? Surely you can spare a moment to entertain us." Emily felt her chest tighten. This wasn't part of her duties, and Mrs. Phillips was already shooting her warning glances from across the room. I'm afraid I'm on duty, Mr. Blackwood." "Nonsense," he declared, taking her serving tray and handing it to a passing waiter. "I insist. Consider it part of your service this evening." His tone was pleasant enough, but there was an edge to it that suggested refusal wasn't an option. The room had grown quiet, and Emily felt dozens of eyes on her as Blackwood practically marched her to the piano. Her cheeks burned with humiliation at being put on display like this, but as she sat down at the instrument, a strange calm settled over her. This Bösendorfer might be grander than her grandfather's Steinway, but the keys beneath her fingers were familiar territory. Without conscious thought, she began to play the piece that had been her grandfather's favorite, Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. The first notes filled the room, and Emily closed her eyes, letting muscle memory take over. She played not for the wealthy audience watching her, but for the memory of early mornings with her grandfather, for the joy music had always brought them both. The room fell completely silent except for the music. Emily lost herself in the piece, her fingers drawing out the melody with all the emotion and skill her years of practice had given her. When the final notes faded away, there was a moment of absolute stillness before the room erupted in applause. When Emily opened her eyes, she saw that the audience had grown. Among them stood an elderly gentleman who was watching her with intense interest. What caught her attention wasn't his obvious appreciation of her performance, but the conductor's baton he was absently tapping against his palm. Blackwood's expression had completely transformed. Gone was the slightly mocking smile, replaced by something more complex, almost troubled. He stared at Emily as if seeing a ghost, his face pale beneath his tan. "Remarkable," the elderly gentleman with the baton said, stepping forward. "Simply remarkable. I don't believe we've been introduced, Miss Barrett. I'm Richard Hawthorne, conductor of the Bath Symphony Orchestra." He handed her a card. "We have an opening for a pianist. I'd very much like you to audition." Emily's hands trembled as she accepted the card, hardly daring to believe this was real. But before she could respond, she noticed Blackwood had disappeared from the room, leaving behind a whispered conversation that spread through the crowd like wildfire. Unknown to Emily, at that very moment, Jonathan Blackwood stood in his study, a leather-bound diary open in his hands. The handwriting on its pages belonged to his mother, and the words he had just read had shaken him to his core. As the sounds of the party drifted up from below, he turned to the next page, unable to stop reading the secret that would change not only his life, but Emily's as well. Long after the last guest had departed and the staff had cleared away the remnants of the party, Jonathan Blackwood remained in his study, surrounded by the ghosts of his past. His mother's diary lay open before him, its pages yellowed with age, filled with elegant handwriting that spoke of secrets kept for decades. "My dearest William," the entry began, dated nearly 46 years ago. "Another season at the Bath Music Festival, another chance to hear you play. If only my husband knew that I slip away every afternoon to watch you perform at the Pump Room. Your music speaks to my soul in ways I cannot express." Jonathan's hands trembled as he turned the pages, reading through his mother's account of a love affair that had bloomed during those summer months in Bath. William Barrett, a talented musician who had captured the heart of Victoria Blackwood, then the young wife of industrialist Richard Blackwood. The same William Barrett who, Jonathan now realized with growing shock, was Emily's grandfather. Meanwhile, across the city, Emily sat at her own piano, still buzzing from the events of the evening. Mr. Hawthorne's business card lay on the music stand before her, representing a chance she had never dared to dream of. The Bath Symphony Orchestra. Her grandfather would have been overjoyed. Her mother Margaret arrived home exhausted from her late shift, but her fatigue vanished when Emily shared her news. An audition with the orchestra? Oh, love, your grandfather would have been so proud. She hugged Emily tightly, then pulled back with concern. But what about Mr. Blackwood? You said he acted strangely? It was odd, Emily admitted, describing how the property developer had practically fled the room after her performance. And there was something about the way he reacted to our surname. Margaret's face clouded briefly, but she quickly smiled. Well, Barrett isn't such an unusual name, is it? The important thing is that you've got this wonderful opportunity. Back at Blackwood Manor, Jonathan had reached the crucial entry. His mother's words, written in an increasingly urgent hand, told of her final meeting with William Barrett. I had to tell him today. The baby, our baby, is coming and I can no longer hide it. William was noble, as always. He understood why we can never acknowledge our child, why I must let Richard believe the baby is his. The scandal would ruin everything, destroy too many lives. The entry ended with a single sentence that made Jonathan's world tilt on its axis. I will name him Jonathan after William's father. Dawn was breaking over Bath when Jonathan finally closed the diary. The truth was undeniable. He was not Richard Blackwood's son, but William Barrett's. Margaret Barrett wasn't just some employee's mother. She was his half-sister. And Emily, the young pianist who had played with such familiar passion, was his niece. The revelation explained so much. His lifelong love of music that his presumed father had never understood, the inexplicable pull he had felt toward the Barrett family name, even his instinct to test Emily's musical ability at the party. The very talents he had tried to mock had turned out to be part of his own heritage. That morning, Emily arrived early at the Royal Crescent Hotel, still running on adrenaline from the previous night. She was surprised to find Jonathan Blackwood waiting in the lobby, looking as though he hadn't slept. "Miss Barrett," he said, his voice carrying none of its previous arrogance. "I wonder if I might have a word with you and your mother. There are some matters of great importance we need to discuss." Emily hesitated, remembering his behavior at the party. "My mother works long shifts at the hospital, Mr. Blackwood. She's quite busy." "Please," he said, and something in his tone made her look at him more closely. The commanding businessman was gone, replaced by someone who seemed almost vulnerable. "It's about your grandfather, William Barrett." Emily's heart skipped a beat. "You knew my grandfather?" "Not exactly," Jonathan replied carefully, "but I've recently discovered that he played a very significant role in my family's history." He handed her an envelope. "Inside you'll find my private number and address. When your mother is available, I would be grateful if you both would visit me. There are things you need to know, things that may change all our lives." Before Emily could respond, Mrs. Phillips appeared with her morning tasks, and Jonathan quietly took his leave. Emily slipped the envelope into her pocket, her mind racing with questions. What could Jonathan Blackwood possibly know about her grandfather? Throughout her shift, Emily found herself watching the local elite as they came and went, wondering about their secrets, their hidden connections. She thought about her grandfather, how he had always seemed to carry a subtle sadness beneath his cheerful exterior, especially when playing certain melodies. Had he taken some secret to his final rest? The envelope in her pocket seemed to grow heavier as the hours passed. Whatever Jonathan Blackwood had to tell them, Emily sensed it would alter the course of their lives forever. As she served tea to the hotel's guests, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the edge of a revelation that would either heal old wounds or create new ones. That evening, when she finally showed the envelope to her mother, Margaret's reaction confirmed her suspicions. Her mother's face went pale, and her hands trembled as she read Blackwood's message. "Perhaps," Margaret said quietly, "it's time you learned the truth about our family." The parlor of Blackwood Manor felt different in daylight. Emily sat beside her mother on an antique sofa, sunlight streaming through tall windows, while Jonathan Blackwood occupied an armchair opposite them. Between them, on a delicate coffee table, lay his mother's diary and a collection of old photographs. Margaret Barrett hadn't spoken since they'd arrived, her eyes fixed on a particular photograph that showed a young William Barrett at the piano, his fingers positioned over the keys, a familiar half-smile on his face. Beside him stood a beautiful young woman in elegant 1970s attire, Victoria Blackwood. "I didn't understand at first," Jonathan began, his voice gentle, "why I felt such a strong reaction to your performance the other night, Emily. But when I heard you play that Chopin piece, it was the same one my mother used to hum when she thought no one was listening." Margaret finally looked up, her eyes glistening. "Father used to say that piece held memories he couldn't share. Now I understand why." Emily watched the interaction between her mother and Jonathan, seeing their similarities for the first time. The same determined set of their jaw, the same expressive hands. How had she not noticed before? "Your father, our father," Jonathan corrected himself, addressing Margaret, "was an extraordinary man. According to my mother's diary, he stepped away not out of cowardice but to protect everyone involved. The scandal would have destroyed multiple families, including yours." "He never knew about me, did he?" Jonathan asked Margaret softly. Margaret shook her head. "No. Mother was already expecting me when she met him. They fell in love during his performances at the Pump Room, but she was married to another man, a kind man who had given her a home when she had nothing. Father couldn't bear to break up that family." Emily struggled to process this information about her grandfather, the man who had patiently taught her every note she knew. "But you knew, Mum, about Jonathan's mother?" "Not until after Father's passing," Margaret admitted. "He left me a letter explaining everything. I found it when we were going through his things. He wanted me to know the truth, but he also wanted to protect us from any potential scandal. The Blackwood name carries significant weight in Bath." Jonathan leaned forward, his expression earnest. "I want you both to know that I'm not interested in scandal or protecting the Blackwood name anymore. When I heard you play, Emily, it was like hearing my mother's stories come to life. The way you touched those keys, it was exactly how she described him." Emily felt tears welling up in her eyes. "The piano he left me, it wasn't just about the music, was it?" "It was his whole heart. A heart that appears to beat in all of us," Jonathan replied, smiling gently. "I may have built my fortune in property development, but I've always been drawn to music. I just never allowed myself to explore that part of my soul. Perhaps I was afraid of what I might discover." Margaret reached out hesitantly and touched Jonathan's hand. "You have his eyes, you know. I always wondered why Father would sometimes look at photographs in the newspaper of you at various development projects. He never said anything, but now I wonder if he knew somehow. I've been thinking," Jonathan said, straightening up. The audition with the Bath Symphony Orchestra. It's next week, isn't it, Emily? Emily nodded, suddenly reminded of the card still safely tucked in her purse. I'd like to help if you'll let me. Not with the audition itself, your talent needs no assistance there, but with everything else. You shouldn't have to work at the hotel anymore. You should be free to practice, to pursue your music without worrying about making ends meet. We can't accept, Margaret began, but Jonathan interrupted gently. Please, Margaret. Consider it 45 years of missed birthday presents from a brother who didn't know he had a sister to cherish. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. Emily watched as her mother's resistance crumbled. For years, Margaret had carried the weight of single parenthood, working double shifts to ensure Emily could keep playing the piano, maintaining the precious instrument that was her father's legacy. There's something else, Jonathan continued, reaching for a folder on a nearby desk. I've been doing some research. Father, William, played with several prestigious orchestras in his youth. I've found recordings, reviews, programs. They belong with you both. As they went through the contents of the folder together, a new kind of music filled the room, the sound of laughter, of stories shared, of connections being forged. Emily discovered that her grandfather had once played at the Royal Albert Hall, that he had toured with a chamber orchestra in his 20s, that his talent had been celebrated in reviews she had never known existed. The garden here at the manor, Jonathan said suddenly. It has excellent acoustics. I've been thinking of building a conservatory, a proper music room. Perhaps, he hesitated, looking between Margaret and Emily, perhaps you both might help me design it, make it a place where music and family can flourish together. As the afternoon light began to fade, Emily found herself sitting at the manor's Bösendorfer again, but this time without fear or hesitation. Her fingers found the keys of Chopin's Nocturne, and as she played, she felt the presence of her grandfather, the echoes of his love story, and the beginning of something new. Margaret and Jonathan stood side by side, listening, their shared blood finally singing the same melody. The music filled every corner of the room, healing old wounds, building new bridges, creating a symphony of reconciliation that their father would have cherished above all else. The week leading up to the audition passed in a whirlwind of changes. Emily had handed in her notice at the Royal Crescent Hotel, though she insisted on working through her full notice period despite Jonathan's protests. It's about doing things properly, she had explained, and her newfound uncle had nodded with unexpected pride. The biggest change came in the form of a baby grand piano appearing in Blackwood Manor's newly cleared conservatory. For practice, Jonathan had said simply, handing Emily a key to the house. The acoustics here are better than in your living room, and you can come any time, day or night. Emily now sat at this piano, the morning sun streaming through the glass ceiling, creating patterns on the polished wood. She had been practicing for hours, preparing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 for her audition. The piece was ambitious, but Richard Hawthorne had specifically requested it when she'd called to arrange the audition time. Your grandfather played that piece magnificently, a voice said from the doorway. Jonathan stood there holding 2 cups of tea. He had taken to working from home more often, his laptop set up in a corner of the conservatory while Emily practiced. I found a review in Mother's Things. He performed it with the Bristol Philharmonic in 1975. Emily accepted the tea gratefully. These small gestures of familial care were still new and somewhat awkward, but increasingly precious. Did you find anything else about his performances? Actually, yes. Jonathan pulled out a yellowed program from his jacket pocket. Look at this. He played at the opening of the 1976 Bath Music Festival, the same festival where, he trailed off, both of them knowing he meant where he had been conceived. A comfortable silence fell between them as Emily sipped her tea. The past week had been full of such moments. Discoveries, connections, shared histories emerging like flowers after rain. Margaret had begun joining them for dinner twice a week, bringing photo albums and memories to share. I've been thinking, Jonathan said, carefully setting down his cup, about the development project in Central Bath, the one that's caused so much controversy. Emily looked up, curious. The project had been in the local news for months, with preservation societies protesting the planned modernization of several historic buildings. I'm going to redesign it, he continued. Instead of luxury apartments, I'm converting the main building into a music school, with proper practice rooms, performance spaces, teaching facilities. Somewhere talents like yours can be nurtured, regardless of background. Emily stared at him astonished. This was the project that had been set to make millions. But the investors can either support the new vision or withdraw, Jonathan said firmly. I've spent years chasing profit at the expense of heritage. Perhaps it's time to honor both, and honor Father's legacy in the process. Before Emily could respond, the conservatory door opened again, and Margaret entered, still in her nurse's uniform from her morning shift. She had started taking fewer extra shifts, finally allowing herself to accept some help from her newfound brother. I thought I'd find you both here, she smiled, then noticed the program in Jonathan's hand. What's that you're looking at? As Jonathan showed her the program, Emily returned to the piano, her fingers finding the keys of the Rachmaninoff piece. She began to play, letting the music swell through the conservatory. Through the corner of her eye, she could see her mother and uncle sitting together, looking through old programs and sharing memories of the father they had known in different ways. The piece built to its crescendo, and Emily felt something shift inside her. This wasn't just practice anymore, it was communion with her grandfather's spirit, a connection to his artistry that ran deeper than she had ever understood. Every note she played was infused with not just technical skill, but with the weight of family history, of love lost and found, of secrets unveiled and wounds healed. When she finished, there was a moment of profound silence before Margaret spoke. You know, your grandfather always said that music wasn't just about hitting the right notes, it was about telling the right story. And what story am I telling? Emily asked softly. Our story, Jonathan answered, his voice thick with emotion. All of us. The story of a family finding its way back to harmony. The rest of the afternoon passed in gentle preparation. Jonathan had arranged for a professional piano tuner to check the instrument one final time before the audition. Margaret fussed over what Emily should wear, while Emily herself concentrated on memorizing every nuance of the challenging piece. As evening approached, they ordered takeaway from Emily's favorite Indian restaurant, spreading out the containers on the conservatory floor like an impromptu picnic. The formality of their first meetings had given way to something more natural, more familial. Tell me more about the music school idea, Emily said between bites of curry. What exactly are you envisioning? Jonathan's eyes lit up as he described his plans. Practice rooms with perfect acoustics, a recital hall, scholarships for talented children from disadvantaged backgrounds. The building has such beautiful bones, he explained. Instead of tearing down walls, we'll work with them. Let the music flow through spaces that have stood for centuries. Margaret reached out and squeezed his hand. Father would have loved that. He always said music belonged to everyone, not just those who could afford crystal chandeliers and golden tickets. As the evening drew to a close, Emily played one final run-through of her audition piece. This time both Margaret and Jonathan closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them. In those moments, Emily felt the presence of her grandfather more strongly than ever, not as a ghost or a memory, but as a living legacy that flowed through their shared blood and shared love of music. Tomorrow would bring the audition, but tonight was for family, for music, for the quiet joy of belonging. As Emily's fingers danced across the keys, she knew that whatever happened at the audition, she had already gained something precious beyond measure, the truth of who she was, and the family who would stand behind her, united by music and love. The Bath Assembly Room stood proudly in the morning light, its Georgian grandeur a fitting stage for the moment that awaited within. Emily stood before the building's columns, her heart thundering in her chest. Behind her, Jonathan's sleek Bentley pulled away from the curb. He had insisted on driving her and Margaret himself. "Ready, love." Margaret squeezed her daughter's hand. She had taken a rare day off from the hospital, refusing to miss this moment. The assembly room's interior was hushed, their footsteps echoing on the historic floors as they followed a student volunteer to the ballroom, where the auditions were being held. The space was magnificent, with crystal chandeliers catching the morning light and ornate mirrors multiplying the brightness. At the center stood a magnificent Steinway concert grand piano, its lid raised like a black wing. Richard Hawthorne sat at a table with 4 other judges, principal players from the orchestra, Emily presumed. They looked up as she entered, and Hawthorne's face brightened with recognition. "Ah, Miss Barrett, welcome." He gestured to the piano. "Whenever you're ready." "The Rachmaninoff, yes?" Emily nodded, unable to trust her voice. As she walked to the piano, she caught her reflection in one of the ornate mirrors. She hardly recognized herself in the elegant dark blue dress Jonathan had insisted on buying her for the occasion. A proper concert dress, he had said, worthy of both the music and the musician. She sat at the piano, adjusting the bench with practiced precision. The keys beneath her fingers felt different from both her grandfather's Steinway and the Manor's new baby grand, but there was something familiar in their weight, their promise. Taking a deep breath, Emily began to play. The opening chords of Rachmaninoff's second piano concerto filled the vast room, deep and resonant. Emily felt the familiar sensation of the world falling away, leaving only the music. But this time something was different. As her fingers moved across the keys, she wasn't just playing notes, she was telling her family's story. The melancholic opening became her grandfather's secret love, the passion he had kept hidden for decades. The building intensity spoke of Jonathan's journey from confusion to understanding, from arrogance to humility. The sweeping romantic themes carried her mother's quiet strength, her years of sacrifice and unwavering support. In the corner of her eye, Emily saw the door open quietly, and Jonathan slipped in, taking a seat beside Margaret. He had promised to return after some urgent business, and true to his word, he was here. The sight gave her renewed confidence, and she poured everything into the performance. The piece built to its first climax, and Emily felt tears pricking at her eyes, not from sadness but from the sheer emotion of the moment. This wasn't just an audition anymore. It was a tribute to her grandfather, to the legacy he had left them all, to the power of music to bridge decades and heal hearts. As she played the final movement, Emily thought of the changes the past weeks had brought. The discovery of family she never knew she had, the understanding of her grandfather's past, the transformation of a seemingly cold-hearted businessman into a caring uncle. Each note carried these stories, these emotions, these truths. The final chords resonated through the room, and for a moment complete silence fell. Emily remained still, hands hovering above the keys, hardly daring to breathe. Then Richard Hawthorne stood up, and to everyone's surprise began to applaud. The other judges followed suit, and Emily turned to see tears in her mother's eyes and an expression of unmistakable pride on Jonathan's face. "Miss Barrett," Hawthorne said, his voice thick with emotion, "I knew your grandfather. I played with him in the Bristol Philharmonic years ago. He had this same ability to make Rachmaninoff sound both technically perfect and profoundly personal. But you," he paused, collecting himself, "you've brought something entirely your own to it as well." One of the other judges, a stern-looking woman with silver hair, leaned forward. "We've heard 12 pianists this week, Miss Barrett. None have moved us quite like this." "The position is yours," Hawthorne said simply, "if you want it." Emily's hands began to tremble. She looked at her mother, who was now openly crying, and at Jonathan, who seemed to be fighting back tears of his own. Yes," Emily managed to say. "Yes, I want it very much." "Excellent," Hawthorne beamed. "We'll begin rehearsals next week. Our first concert of the season is in 2 months, featuring, as it happens, this very concerto." As the judges gathered their things, discussing details of contracts and schedules, Emily remained at the piano, one hand resting on the keys. She could almost feel her grandfather's presence, could almost hear his voice saying, "Music finds its way, love. It always finds its way." Margaret and Jonathan approached the piano, and Emily stood to embrace them both. Their small family circle, once broken by secrets and circumstance, now whole and healing. Through the assembly room's tall windows, sunlight streamed in, catching the crystals in the chandeliers and scattering rainbow lights across the floor like musical notes come to life. "He would have been so proud," Margaret whispered, holding her daughter tight. "He is proud," Jonathan corrected gently. "Wherever he is, he's proud of all of us." And in that moment, surrounded by love and light and the lingering echoes of Rachmaninoff, Emily knew they were both right. The music had found its way, just as her grandfather had promised it would. The first week of rehearsals with the Bath Symphony Orchestra brought changes that rippled through every aspect of Emily's life. Gone were the early morning shifts at the hotel, replaced by hours of practice and rehearsal in the orchestra's historic home. The other musicians, initially curious about the new pianist who had so impressed their conductor, quickly welcomed her into their ranks. One sunny morning, Emily arrived at the rehearsal hall to find Jonathan waiting outside. Architectural plans spread across the hood of his car. He had been true to his word about the music school project, and the local papers were buzzing with news of Blackwood Development's unexpected change of direction. "What do you think?" he asked, showing her the latest designs. "We've preserved the original Georgian features, but look here. The main hall will have acoustics to rival any concert venue in the country." Emily studied the plans, noting how the historic building's grand rooms had been reimagined as practice spaces and performance venues. "It's beautiful, Jonathan. But won't your investors be upset about the change?" "Some have withdrawn," he admitted, folding the plans carefully. "But others, well, it seems I'm not the only one who believes in the power of music to transform lives. The City Council has unanimously approved the project, and we've already received inquiries from several music education charities about partnerships." Inside the rehearsal hall, Richard Hawthorne was working with the string section when Emily arrived at the piano. "Ah, Miss Barrett, perfect timing." "Perfect. Let's take the second movement from bar 47, that lovely conversation between piano and strings." As Emily played, she caught sight of Jonathan slipping into the hall, taking a seat in the back to listen. He had been doing this more often lately, spending his lunch breaks watching rehearsals, his laptop forgotten beside him as he lost himself in the music. During their break, Hawthorne approached her with news that made her heart skip a beat. "The Royal Albert Hall has confirmed the date for our London performance next season. You'll be our featured soloist, my dear. Your grandfather would have been over the moon. He gave one of his finest performances there." The mention of her grandfather brought a warm smile to Emily's face. Since the truth had come to light, she had discovered so many stories about him, each one a precious thread connecting past to present. Through Jonathan's research and Hawthorne's memories, William Barrett was becoming more than just the patient grandfather who had taught her scales. He was emerging as a brilliant musician whose legacy lived on in unexpected ways. That evening, Margaret joined them for dinner at Blackwood Manor, bringing a surprise of her own. She had finally accepted Jonathan's offer to reduce her nursing hours, allowing her to pursue a long-dormant dream of teaching music to children at the local primary school. "I may not have Father's gift for performance," she said, as they sat in the conservatory after dinner, "but I remember everything he taught me about teaching, about patience, and understanding that every child finds their own way to music." "You'll be perfect for the school project then," Jonathan said, his eyes lighting up. "We're planning to include a children's program, basic music education for local schools. Would you consider being involved in developing it?" Emily watched as her mother's face brightened with possibility. The woman who had spent decades working double shifts to keep their small family afloat was finally allowing herself to dream again. As the evening wore on, Emily found herself at the piano playing softly while Margaret and Jonathan discussed plans for the music school. The piece she chose was not Rachmaninoff or Chopin, but a simple melody her grandfather had composed, one of several Jonathan had discovered among Victoria's papers. "I remember that tune," Margaret said suddenly, closing her eyes. "Father used to play it on Sunday afternoons, though he never told me he'd written it himself. Mother's diary says he composed it the summer they met," Jonathan added quietly. "She called it their secret symphony." Emily continued playing, adding her own subtle variations to her grandfather's melody. Through the conservatory's glass ceiling, the first stars were becoming visible in the darkening sky. The room felt full of possibility, of dreams taking shape, of old wounds healing through the balm of music and understanding. Later, as Jonathan walked them to their car, he hesitated, then pulled an envelope from his pocket. "I've been doing some research into Father's family history," he said. "It seems the Barrett musical talent goes back generations. I found records of a Barrett playing at the Bath Assembly Rooms as far back as 1817. I thought you might like to see these documents, to know where you come from." Emily took the envelope, touched by his continued efforts to piece together their shared history. "Will you come to tomorrow's rehearsal?" she asked. "We're working on the first movement again, and I think I've finally found the right feeling for that tricky transition passage." He smiled, the expression transforming his once stern face. "I wouldn't miss it. Though I should warn you, I've been seen at so many rehearsals lately. There's a rumor going around Bath that Jonathan Blackwood has gone soft." "Not soft," Margaret corrected gently. "Just more in tune with what truly matters." As they drove home through the quiet streets of Bath, Emily thought about how much had changed in such a short time. The city itself seemed different now, its Georgian facades hiding not just history, but possibility. Every stone, every corner held music, just as her grandfather had always told her. She just hadn't understood until now that the music wasn't just in the notes she played, but in the bonds being forged, the hearts being healed, the dreams being born. The historic building that would house the Barrett Blackwood Music Academy was slowly transforming. On a crisp autumn morning, Emily walked through the construction site beside Jonathan, both wearing hard hats as workers carefully restored the Georgian features while installing state-of-the-art acoustical treatments. "Barrett Blackwood?" Emily asked, raising an eyebrow at the sign mock-up Jonathan had just shown her. "Are you sure about the name?" Jonathan nodded, his expression serious. "It's time both sides of our family's legacy were acknowledged. Besides," he added with a slight smile, "it has a certain musical ring to it, don't you think?" They paused in what would become the main performance hall. Sunlight streamed through newly restored windows, illuminating the elaborate plasterwork that craftsmen were painstakingly returning to its original glory. The space reminded Emily of the assembly rooms where she had auditioned, but there was something more intimate about it, more welcoming. "Richard Hawthorne has agreed to serve on the advisory board," Jonathan announced, consulting his phone. "And we've had inquiries from several respected musicians about teaching positions. The word is spreading fast in the classical music community." Emily wasn't surprised. In the weeks since her appointment to the orchestra, she had discovered that the classical music world was smaller than she had imagined, connected by invisible threads of relationships and shared histories. Her grandfather's name, it turned out, still carried weight in certain circles. "Have you seen today's paper?" Jonathan asked, pulling a folded copy of the Bath Chronicle from his briefcase. The headline read, "Historic Building Finds New Purpose, From Luxury Flats to Musical Legacy." The article detailed Jonathan's dramatic shift from controversial developer to cultural patron, complete with quotes from local preservation societies that had once been his harshest critics. There was even a photograph of him with Margaret at a community meeting, discussing plans for the Academy's outreach programs. "Your mother's ideas about early music education have really resonated with the council," Jonathan said proudly. "They've agreed to partner with us to provide transportation for students from outlying areas who couldn't otherwise attend." As they continued their tour, Emily's phone buzzed with a message from Richard Hawthorne. The orchestra's first concert of the season was approaching, and he wanted to adjust their rehearsal schedule. The Rachmaninoff concerto was coming together beautifully, but he felt they could push it even further. "I should get going," Emily said, checking the time. "Extra rehearsal this afternoon." "Wait!" Jonathan called as she turned to leave. "There's something else I want to show you." He led her to a smaller room on the second floor, where workers were installing wooden panels with mathematical precision. "This will be your private practice room," he explained. "The acoustics are being calibrated specifically for piano. And look," he walked to the window. "You can see the Abbey from here." Emily felt tears pricking at her eyes. The room was perfect, from its proportions to its view of Bath's historic heart. "Jonathan, I don't know what to say." "Say you'll help us make this place everything it should be," he replied. "Not just as a performer, but as a teacher. We want to create something lasting here, something that would make Father proud." The mention of her grandfather made Emily think of the piano still sitting in their modest living room. "I've been thinking," she said slowly, "maybe the Steinway should come here. Not my personal practice instrument, but as part of the academy. Grandfather would have wanted it to be somewhere it could inspire other young musicians." Jonathan's eyes softened. "Are you sure? It was his gift to you." "The music he taught me was the real gift," Emily replied. "The piano should be where others can learn from it too." They stood in comfortable silence, imagining the room filled with music, with students, with possibility. Through the window, the Bath Abbey's towers rose against the autumn sky, just as they had in her grandfather's time, in the days when he and Victoria had created their own secret symphony. Later that afternoon, at orchestra rehearsal, Emily found herself playing with renewed energy. The Rachmaninoff concerto had become more than just a piece of music. It was a bridge between past and present, between who she had been and who she was becoming. During a break, Richard Hawthorne approached her piano. "There's something different today," he observed. "The second movement especially. You found a new depth in it." Emily thought about the morning's visit to the academy site, about Jonathan's transformation, about her mother's growing confidence in pursuing her own dreams. "I think I'm finally understanding what grandfather meant," she said, "about music being more than just the notes we play." Hawthorne nodded approvingly. "William always said that true music comes from life itself, from love, from loss, from hope. Speaking of which," he paused, shuffling through his papers, "the Royal Albert Hall has requested our program notes for next season. They'd like to include a special mention of your family connection to the venue. Would you be comfortable with that?" The question gave Emily pause. Once, the idea of such public attention would have terrified her. Now she felt ready to embrace her heritage, both the Barrett and the Blackwood sides of her story. "Yes," she said firmly, "I think it's time our family's story was told properly." As the afternoon light began to fade, Emily found herself playing the simple melody her grandfather had composed for Victoria. The other musicians had gone home, but the music filled the empty hall with memories, with dreams, with the promise of tomorrow. Outside, Bath was preparing for evening, its honey-colored stone glowing in the setting sun. In hospitals and construction sites, in practice rooms and family homes, the threads of lives were weaving together, creating a tapestry of redemption and renewal that even the most beautiful music could only begin to express. The week before the Bath Symphony Orchestra's season-opening concert brought a frenzy of activity that touched every aspect of Emily's life. The assembly rooms were abuzz with final rehearsals, while across town, the Barrett Blackwood Music Academy was preparing for its own debut, scheduled strategically for the week after the concert. Emily's days had become a carefully orchestrated symphony of their own. Mornings were devoted to practice at the Manor's Conservatory, afternoons to rehearsals with the orchestra, and evenings to helping Margaret and Jonathan finalize details for the Academy's opening. "The pianos arrive tomorrow," Jonathan announced during one of their now regular family dinners at the Manor, including a rather special delivery from Germany. Margaret looked up from the course curriculum she was reviewing. "The Bechstein you mentioned." "A concert grand for the main hall," Jonathan confirmed, "but that's not the special part." "Emily, remember how we discussed bringing grandfather's Steinway to the Academy?" Emily nodded, still feeling somewhat emotional about the decision to move her beloved piano from home. "Well, I did some research into its history," Jonathan continued. "It turns out it was one of only 50 made in that particular year, and the craftsman who restored it for father was renowned in his field. I've arranged for the same workshop, they're still operating in Hamburg, to do a complete restoration before it takes its place in the Academy." Emily felt tears welling up. "Jonathan, that must have cost—" He waved away her concern. "Consider it an investment in our family's legacy. Besides," he added with a slight smile, "the tax benefits of philanthropic donations are quite favorable." The following morning, Emily arrived at the assembly rooms for the orchestra's final rehearsal to find Richard Hawthorne in an unusually excited state. "Wonderful news," he announced as she set up her music. "The concert is completely sold out, and we've had inquiries from several London critics. Word of your grandfather's connection to the piece has sparked quite a bit of interest." As they began the rehearsal, Emily felt a new energy in the orchestra. The months of preparation were culminating in something that went beyond mere performance. When they reached the second movement of the Rachmaninoff concerto, she could feel every musician leaning into the music, supporting her piano lines with an almost telepathic sensitivity. "That's it, exactly," Hawthorne called out during a pause. "You're not just playing together, you're breathing together. This is what making music is all about." During their break, Emily checked her phone to find a message from Jonathan. The local paper wanted to do a feature story on the Academy, focusing on the family connection and the transformation of both the building and the Blackwood business model. Would she be willing to be interviewed? The old Emily might have hesitated, but now she found herself typing an immediate yes. Their story deserved to be told, not just for themselves, but for anyone who had ever felt trapped by circumstances or separated from their true calling. That evening, Emily went to see the Academy one last time before its completion. The workers had gone home, leaving the building in a state of peaceful anticipation. Her footsteps echoed on the newly restored floors as she made her way to what would be her teaching studio. The room was nearly finished, lacking only its piano and some final touches. But as she stood by the window, watching the sunset paint Bath's skyline in shades of gold, She could already imagine the space filled with music, with learning, with the kind of joy her grandfather had given her. A sound from the doorway made her turn. Margaret and Jonathan stood there, both carrying what looked like old photo albums. "We thought we might find you here," Margaret said softly. "We've been going through some old things, and look what we found." They sat on the floor together, spreading out the albums. There were photographs Emily had never seen before. Her grandfather in his prime, performing at various venues. In one particularly striking image, he sat at a piano on the Royal Albert Hall stage, his expression one of complete absorption in the music. "That was his last performance there," Jonathan said, pointing to the date on the program that accompanied the photo. "Just a few months before." He paused, glancing at Margaret. "Before he met Victoria," Margaret finished quietly. "Before everything changed." Emily traced the outline of her grandfather in the photograph. "Do you think he regretted it?" "The choices he made? No," Margaret said firmly. "Father once told me that every life has its own melody. Sometimes it's not the one we expected to play, but it's ours all the same." "Speaking of melodies," Jonathan added, reaching into his briefcase, "I've found something else you might be interested in." He pulled out a bundle of yellowed manuscript paper covered in familiar handwriting. Some of Father's original compositions. Most were never performed publicly, but he handed them to Emily. Perhaps it's time they were. As Emily looked through the manuscripts, she felt a deep connection to her grandfather's creative spirit. His notes, written in careful pencil, spoke of the same passion for music that burned in her own heart. "The Academy's opening gala," she said suddenly. "We should perform one of these, not just as a tribute, but as a bridge between past and future." Jonathan's eyes lit up. The perfect way to launch both the Academy and its mission. As night fell over Bath, the three of them remained in the empty room, planning and dreaming. Through the window, they could see lights coming on across the city, each one a reminder of the lives that would be touched by the Academy, by the music, by the healing power of truth and reconciliation. Tomorrow would bring final rehearsals, last-minute preparations, and all the nervous energy of approaching performances. But for now, in this quiet moment, Emily felt perfectly at peace. She was exactly where she was meant to be, carrying forward a legacy that was bigger than any one person, yet intimately personal to them all. The evening of the concert arrived with an almost ethereal quality. The Bath assembly rooms glowed from within, its Georgian splendor enhanced by the excitement of a full house. In the performers' area, Emily sat quietly in her dressing room, wearing the midnight blue concert gown that had become something of a good luck charm since her audition. A gentle knock at the door revealed Margaret, Jonathan, and to Emily's surprise, Richard Hawthorne. The conductor was holding what appeared to be an antique jewelry box. "We have something for you," Margaret said softly. Jonathan found it among Victoria's possessions. Hawthorne stepped forward, opening the box to reveal a delicate pearl brooch in the shape of a treble clef. "Victoria wore this the last time William performed here," he explained. "She was in the audience, though few knew the significance of her presence. Here it seems fitting that you should wear it tonight." As Margaret pinned the brooch to Emily's gown, their eyes met in the mirror. No words were needed. The weight of history, of family, of healing hung in the air between them. "5 minutes, Miss Barrett," called the stage manager from the hallway. Jonathan squeezed Emily's shoulder. "We'll be in the family box," he said. "The same one Mother used to sit in, as it happens." The assembly room's main hall was packed to capacity. Through a gap in the curtain, Emily could see familiar faces from Bath's musical community, journalists from London, and even some of her former colleagues from the Royal Crescent Hotel. In the family box, Margaret and Jonathan sat together, their presence a reminder of how far they had all come. The orchestra was already seated when Emily made her entrance. The applause that greeted her was warm, encouraging, but she barely heard it. Her focus was entirely on the magnificent Steinway before her, its keys waiting to help tell their family's story. Richard Hawthorne took his place at the podium, and with a small nod to Emily raised his baton. The opening chords of Rachmaninoff's Second Piano Concerto filled the historic space, dark and resonant. As Emily played, she felt something extraordinary happening. Every hour of practice, every family story discovered, every moment of connection seemed to flow through her fingers into the music. The first movement unfolded like a narrative, the passion of secret love, the weight of choices made, The power of truth finally spoken. In the family box, Jonathan sat completely still, his eyes closed. Through the music, he was remembering his mother, understanding her in a way he never had before. Beside him, Margaret held his hand, their shared connection to William Barrett stronger than ever. The second movement began, and Emily felt herself transported. This wasn't just a performance anymore. It was a communion with everyone and everything that had brought her to this moment. The piano's voice soared above the orchestra, telling of love and loss, of secrets kept and revealed, of family torn apart and made whole again. As she played the final movement, Emily thought of the academy that would open its doors the following week. She thought of young musicians who would find their voices there, of dreams that would take shape within its walls. The music swelled with possibility, with promise, with the certainty that some things were meant to be. The final chords resonated through the assembly rooms, and for a moment, complete silence fell. Then the audience erupted in applause, rising to their feet in a spontaneous standing ovation. Emily stood, acknowledging first the orchestra, then Hawthorne, before turning to the audience. In the family box, Jonathan and Margaret stood applauding with tears streaming down their faces. The pearl brooch at Emily's throat caught the light, sending tiny rainbows dancing across the ceiling, a final gift from Victoria to the granddaughter she had never known. Flowers appeared on stage, roses from the orchestra, a spectacular bouquet from Jonathan, and a simple bunch of wild blooms that Emily knew must be from her mother. But the most touching tribute came from Richard Hawthorne, who stepped down from his podium to present her with a single white lily. "Your grandfather always gave Victoria a white lily before his performances," he said quietly, for her ears alone. Some traditions deserve to live on. The applause continued, calling Emily back for 3 encores. For the final one, she made a decision. Reaching into her music folder, she withdrew one of her grandfather's manuscript compositions, the piece he had written for Victoria during that fateful summer. "This is a very special piece," she announced to the audience, her voice clear and confident. "It has never been performed in public before. My grandfather, William Barrett, composed it for someone he loved deeply. Tonight it's my privilege to share it with you all." As she played the gentle, romantic melody, Emily felt the presence of her grandfather stronger than ever. She played for him, for Victoria, for the love that had given her Jonathan as an uncle, for her mother's quiet strength, for all the twists and turns of fate that had brought them to this moment. The piece ended with a delicate ascending phrase that seemed to float away into the carved ceiling of the assembly rooms. In the profound silence that followed, Emily felt something settle in her heart, a sense of completion, of circles closing, of harmony restored. Later at the reception, Emily found herself surrounded by family. Not just Margaret and Jonathan, but the entire orchestra, who had become a second family to her over the months of rehearsal. Richard Hawthorne raised a toast to her, to the academy, to the power of music to heal and unite. Outside, Bath's honey-colored buildings glowed in the evening light. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new students at the academy, new music to master. But tonight, in this moment, everything was exactly as it should be. The secret symphony of their family had finally been played in full, and its echoes would resonate for generations to come. The morning of the Barrett Blackwood Music Academy's opening dawned bright and clear. The restored Georgian building stood proudly in the heart of Bath, its freshly cleaned stone glowing in the autumn sunlight. Inside, the newly installed pianos waited silently for their first students, including William Barrett's restored Steinway, which now occupied a place of honor in the main hall. Emily arrived early, wearing the pearl brooch from her concert performance. The past week had been a whirlwind of acclaim and attention. The London critics had been effusive in their praise, with one notable reviewer describing her performance as a revelation of musical heritage reborn. But today marked the beginning of something even more meaningful. "The first students arrive in an hour," Margaret said, joining her daughter in the entrance hall. She had traded her nurse's uniform for a more professional outfit, befitting her new role as the Academy's early education coordinator. "I can hardly believe this is really happening." Jonathan appeared from his office, carrying a stack of programs for the opening ceremony. The local press had been fascinated by his transformation from property developer to cultural patron, but what few realized was how naturally he had taken to his new role. The business skills that had once been directed at maximizing profits were now focused on making music accessible to all. "The scholarship applications have exceeded all our projections," he announced, setting down the programs. "We've had interest from families across the entire West Country. The Council's transportation support program is already proving essential." Emily walked through the building, taking in all the final details. Her teaching studio was ready, the afternoon sun streaming through its windows just as she had imagined it would. On the wall hung a black and white photograph of her grandfather performing at the Royal Albert Hall, alongside a more recent image of Emily at her debut concert. The practice rooms were a marvel of acoustic engineering, each one perfectly calibrated for different instruments. The main performance hall, where William Steinway now resided, had been restored to its original Georgian splendor, while incorporating state-of-the-art sound technology. "Miss Barrett?" a voice called from the entrance. It was Richard Hawthorne, arriving early for the opening ceremony. "I hope you don't mind, but I've brought someone who very much wanted to see this." Behind him stood an elderly woman, Emily recognized as the former principal cellist of the Bristol Philharmonic. "I played with your grandfather," she said, her eyes bright with memories. "When I heard about this place, about what your family has created here, well, I wondered if you might be interested in having an old musician volunteer sometime to teach." Before Emily could respond, more visitors began arriving. Musicians she had performed with, former colleagues from the hotel, members of Bath's arts community. Each one seemed to bring another piece of the puzzle, another connection to the past, another possibility for the future. The opening ceremony itself was a celebration of everything the Academy represented. Jonathan spoke about the importance of preserving cultural heritage while making it accessible to new generations. Margaret shared her vision for early music education, drawing on both her father's teaching philosophy and her own experiences as a single mother supporting a talented child. When it was Emily's turn to speak, she found herself looking out at faces both familiar and new. "Music has the power to bridge any divide," she said, her voice steady and clear. "It can heal old wounds, reveal hidden truths, and create connections we never knew were possible. This academy isn't just about teaching notes on a page. It's about continuing a legacy of love, understanding, and the transformative power of artistic expression." The highlight of the ceremony came when Emily took her place at her grandfather's restored Steinway. She had chosen to perform another of his recently discovered compositions, this one a piece he had written but never performed, dedicated to his daughter Margaret. As she played, Emily could feel the room responding to the music. The acoustics were perfect, but it was more than that. There was a sense of rightness, of completion, of dreams taking physical form. Through the windows, she could see people gathering on the street outside, drawn by the music floating out into the autumn air. After the ceremony, as the first students began arriving for their inaugural lessons, Emily watched Jonathan giving a tour to some local officials. He stopped at each practice room, explaining not just the technical specifications but the philosophy behind them, how every detail had been designed to nurture and support young musicians. Margaret had already gathered a small group of young children, sitting cross-legged on the floor as she introduced them to rhythm through a simple clapping game. Her face glowed with the same passion Emily remembered from her own early lessons with her grandfather. In her teaching studio, Emily prepared to meet her first student, a young girl from one of Bath's less privileged neighborhoods, supported by the Academy's scholarship program. On her desk stood a framed photograph she particularly treasured, a recent image of herself, Margaret and Jonathan, taken at the Manners Conservatory. Beside it lay her grandfather's original manuscripts, ready to inspire a new generation. As she heard footsteps approaching her studio, Emily thought about the journey that had brought them all to this point. From a humble terraced house with an inherited piano to this magnificent academy. From separate lives marked by secrets to a united family bound by love and music. The knock on her door signaled the beginning of her first lesson, but it was more than that. It was the beginning of a new movement in their family's symphony, one that would continue to play for years to come, touching lives and creating harmonies they had only begun to imagine. 1 year later, the Barrett Blackwood Music Academy had become an integral part of Bath's cultural landscape. On a warm spring evening, its halls were filled with the sound of music drifting from various practice rooms, a teenage violinist working on a Vivaldi concerto, a piano quartet rehearsing Mozart, a children's choir learning their first harmonies. Emily sat in her teaching studio, reviewing the program for the Academy's first anniversary concert. The event would showcase students from all levels, culminating in her performance with the Bath Symphony Orchestra. But this time, she wouldn't be playing Rachmaninoff. Instead, the evening would feature a complete suite of William Barrett's recently discovered compositions, orchestrated by Richard Hawthorne himself. A knock at her door revealed Jonathan, who had just returned from a conference in London, where he'd presented the Academy as a model for cultural preservation and community engagement. The project had garnered national attention, inspiring similar initiatives in other historic cities. The Arts Council representatives were impressed, he said, settling into a chair. They're considering using our scholarship program as a template for national implementation. But that's not why I'm here. He pulled out an old envelope from his briefcase. Look what I found in Mother's safety deposit box. Inside was a series of photographs Emily had never seen before. They showed Victoria and William at the Bath Music Festival, caught in candid moments between performances. In one particularly touching image, they sat together at a piano, their heads bent close as they examined a piece of music. They looked so happy, Emily observed, touching the photograph gently. They were, in their way, Jonathan replied. I've come to understand that their love story, complicated as it was, gave us all something precious. Not just music, but the chance to be who we truly are. The Academy had indeed allowed everyone to embrace their true calling. Margaret had flourished in her role as education director, her natural empathy and understanding of children making her beloved by students and parents alike. She had recently been invited to present her early music education methods at a national teaching conference. Jonathan, while still overseeing his property development company, had shifted its focus entirely to cultural and community projects. The success of the Academy had led to similar restoration projects across the country, each designed to preserve historical buildings while giving them new culturally significant purposes. Emily herself had found a perfect balance between performing and teaching. Her debut at the Royal Albert Hall had led to numerous invitations to perform across Europe, but she always returned to Bath, to her students, to the family they had built. As the evening light filled her studio, Emily heard the familiar sound of small feet running down the hallway, her youngest students arriving for their group lesson. Among them was a particularly talented girl who reminded Emily of herself at that age, right down to the way she approached the piano with a mixture of reverence and joy. "Ready for tomorrow's concert?" Jonathan asked, gathering up the photographs. Emily nodded, touching the pearl brooch she now wore to every performance. "I think Grandfather would have loved hearing his music played in full orchestra arrangement, especially here, in a place where so many young musicians are finding their way." Later that evening, after the last student had left and the practice rooms had fallen silent, Emily, Margaret and Jonathan gathered in the main hall. The setting sun cast long shadows across William's restored Steinway, now bearing the marks of daily use, a working instrument, just as he would have wanted. Margaret ran her hand along the piano's polished surface. "Sometimes I think I can hear him playing, early in the morning when the building is empty." "Perhaps you do," Jonathan said softly. "Not as a ghost, but as an echo in the music we've all carried forward." Emily sat at the piano, her fingers finding the keys of that first composition she had discovered among her grandfather's papers. As she played, she thought about the journey that had brought them here, from secrets and separation to understanding and unity, from a single inherited piano to an academy full of instruments and aspirations. The music filled the hall, but it was different now. No longer a secret melody played in solitude, but a shared heritage that had touched hundreds of lives. Through the Academy's windows, she could see Bath Abbey silhouetted against the evening sky, its towers standing eternal witness to the city's stories of love, loss, and redemption. Tomorrow would bring the anniversary concert, with its proud parents and nervous students, its celebration of talent both emerging and established. But for now, in this quiet moment, Emily felt the presence of all those who had brought them to this point. William and Victoria, whose love had started it all. The generations of Barretts who had passed down their musical gifts. The teachers and students who were carrying those gifts forward. As the last notes faded away, Emily felt a profound sense of completion. Their family story had become more than just a private tale of secrets and revelations. It had transformed into a living legacy, a continuing symphony that would play on through the lives of every student who walked through the academy's doors. Margaret and Jonathan sat in peaceful silence, each lost in their own thoughts but connected by the bonds of music and blood that had brought them together. Through the open windows came the soft sounds of the city settling into evening. Church bells, distant voices, the eternal music of life itself. The once broken circles of their family had been made whole, not by erasing the past but by embracing it, understanding it, and transforming it into something beautiful. In the end, Emily realized, that was what music had always been about, taking the raw materials of experience and crafting them into something that could touch hearts, heal wounds, and bring people together in harmony. As they finally rose to leave, Emily took one last look at the hall, at the piano, at the photographs on the walls that told their family's story. Tomorrow would bring new music, new students, new challenges. But tonight, in this moment, the symphony was complete. Every note exactly where it was meant to be.